So appreciate it. So first of all, I think everybody on stage here should be well known to a lot of folks in the crowd. We're going to do just real brief intros, just for those who may not know, and then we got some issues we want to talk about. I would like, and I'm going to spring on this on the panel, is we need to focus on the future recommendations. So as you're doing your intro, as far as your background, maybe one thing you want to see happen in the next 12 months as far as policy. So I'll start with you, Michael. Introduction and then one thing.
I'm definitely stealing our market reprisal discussion. I'm glad I get to go first. So my name is Mike McLaughlin. I'm a cybersecurity attorney with the law firm Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney. I lead our cybersecurity and data privacy practice group specializing in incident response. Prior to practicing law, I spent 15 years in the Navy as a counterintelligence officer. I was the senior counterintelligence advisor for U.S. Cyber Command and the chief of counterintelligence and human intelligence for the Cyber National Mission Force. One thing I would want to see is I want to see the government start looking into the possibility of issuing letters of marque and reprisal for the private sector to start being proactive about cyber defense.
All right, Chris.
All right, that was super quick. So Chris Cleary, I'm currently the vice president of cyber at Mantech International. I also run an organization called the Military Cyber Professionals Association, which is sort of how do we represent sort of the community moving forward. Retired naval officer. I guess my pinnacle sort of assignment in the Department of Defense was the principal cyber advisor for the Department of the Navy. We were talking, and the one thing I think we should talk about, because we were talking about this before we got up here, this idea of whether it was privateering or letters of marque, but there certainly has to be an additional capacity brought to this problem that I think certain communities or organizations or industries have been sort of kept out of the game a little bit, other than providing products and services. There has to be a way that we marshal that force moving forward.
Mark.
Thanks. Mark Montgomery. I'm at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, retired Navy admiral, and I ran the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Well, the one thing I want, obvious, I think we need a better force generation model. If we're going to have peace through cyber strength, we actually have to have strength. To have strength, we have to have a cyber force or an independent cyber service. I think if we need proof of that, wait till you hear who's going to be the next cyber command commander and tell me if that would have happened if we had a cyber force, because I think we're going to pick a non-cyber person to run cyber force. And even if we don't, our force generation model has broken beyond repair.
All right.
So it's always hard to follow Mark because he's not going to leave you on a good note. Matt Hayden, CISA and DHS legacy, and currently at General Dynamics, GDIT, helping them out with cyber strategies across the board, basically planted right in the middle between Homeland and critical infrastructure and intelligence. The one thing I would say is that we have a force generation problem, as Mark highlights, but we also have a critical infrastructure kind of problem where we're expecting all boats to rise together. We're expecting a lot of investment to come, and we're not really structured to really just hand that over to the states or hand that over to any federal agency at the moment. So looking for some policy that really adds rigor for that community-based approach to critical infrastructure at a state level so that we can actually start to build some momentum as opposed to telling power to do one thing individually and then giving money to the states and. So that's one of those passion projects at the moment.
All right, and then so I'm Lucian Niemeyer. I'm not the moderator. I'm more an arbitrator. You got some big minds up here. So the goal here over the next 40 minutes or so is to challenge the audience and more importantly, challenge each other on moving forward. What do we need to do? My background, Senate staffer for 11 years, along with shared Mark's, did a similar role. And then I went in Department of Defense, Assistant Secretary of Defense for 3.5 years looking at installations. Since then, I started a nonprofit called Building Cybersecurity. We'd love for you all to find out more about that nonprofit. But most importantly is there's a lot of folks up on this dais right now who are working with various entities within the current administration to push cybersecurity policy forward. So if I have one thing that I want to leave the audience with, it's going to be a challenge because I'm not going to be at Shark Tank this afternoon. We need to, Bryson, with this expertise that you have built here in critical effect, we need to start coalescing on a series of ideas to submit to the administration in the form of a new executive order. I'm personally not a fan of the executive order that came out on last Friday on cybersecurity. And so I think there's a lot of expertise that you've gathered that have been gathered talking to the various rooms here. We got to stop talking. We got to put stuff down in writing and not necessarily, here's what's wrong with the country, but concise, as the congressman said, concise ideas, put them together in a format I worked at OMB for a long time. I know how to write an executive order, take the ideas from everybody in this room, this dais and others, and put them away and get them up to administration as a series of recommendations. I don't know if those of you were in previous session, the communication, other than what Mark has done personally, the communication between the industry and the Hill is broken. We can only last so long on Solarium Commission recommendations. Mark, we've got to come up with a new way to get things to the Cyber Caucus, and we've got to revive the Cyber Caucus. That's my one thing. So, want to know for questions. If you all had to write an executive order right now, the next one for President Trump, what would you want to highlight? I'll just throw it up into the field.
I'd highlight, yesterday I did a good 25-minute rant on here on military mobility. I think he needs to direct the federal agencies involved in the rail, highway, ports, and aviation system to ensure that they are, properly secure to allow our military equipment to move from ports to ports. The reason I say start with that is it has a clear national security narrative to it. So the president can pick these four. None of these are the worst sectors for sector risk management. None of them are the best. So it's a perfect target set for, hey, we can prove that the executive branch with support with backstopping from the legislature with appropriations can properly work with industry to secure these critical infrastructures. Added bonus, they're also critical to economic productivity. Double added bonus, they're also good for public health and safety. But you make it as a national security narrative. The EOs that are anchored in national security do the best. I'd even consider a national security memorandum on this, Vice, an executive order. But either way, strong direction to TSA, FAA, the Highway Bureau, and U.S. Coast Guard to get their act together as sector risk management agencies so we have secure critical infrastructure for military mobility.
100% agree. Before I go on, because I do want everyone to be able to provide their number one recommendation. Before we go on, he mentioned FAA. So there, for those of you who are in town next week, there's a Defend the Airport. It used to be Hack the Airport, so they've caught on. Hack the doesn't quite work. So there's a Defend the Airport conference next week in Columbia, Maryland, where the FAA is going to be there. And we're going to do exactly what Mark is saying, come up with some recommendations for the FAA. How do we actually modernize our cyber protection policy around airports, not necessarily airlines or aircraft, airports, but moving down the direction towards what can the FAA do to ultimately assist and work with airports, small, medium, and large, to enhance cyber safety, cybersecurity. Okay, back to the question. I'll go with you. I know you were next. What would you want to see in an executive order moving forward?
Well, the springboarding off of Mark, he's got an opportunity there for forced collaboration at a tactical level, because you can't just say get those four sectors together and just bang heads. You have to actually give them an ability to tactically operate with the same ConOps or same vision of the threat landscape. And I almost lean towards grabbing one of our existing joint cyber operations kind of models, as opposed to just turning it to
Coast Guard model, maybe?
It likely would be. But the problem is we're kind of shopping for what fits, as opposed to, because if you're talking executive order, you're not talking building, you're talking bonding. And so we're trying to just grab what could be effective. Yeah. And so looking at where some of those joint operations take place now, so you're probably going to have to build up a joint cyber operations mindset for those sectors to operate together in pick some targeted areas or pinch points that could establish that as a priority, especially with the defense logistics aspect in mind.
Yeah, I think, during transition, we played around with the paper about almost creating a formal operation led by Northcom, where you bring in that joint agency and you start looking at collective defense. Biggest problem right now, we're bifurcated as a nation in how we're looking at cyber defense. So I appreciate that thought. I know you were jumping on the Coast Guard model, either one.
Yeah, I won't pivot on that, because I do think the Coast Guard model is probably, if you were going to make it a military sort of model, the Coast Guard would be a better model than, let's say, the Navy, because of their authorities and things they have to do. But even before, if we were to get an executive order, this is why I ran out to, because I'd asked the congressman a question before he was going. And for some reason, I just don't think we're making the argument stick. Right. So the point is, we all know that the threat is there's a million technologies out there we can bring to the problem set. But for some reason, it's not landing. And because he's a rugby player and all this other stuff, I said, have you ever seen the movie Ghostbusters? And he goes, of course I've seen it, Chris. I said, the scene at the end of Ghostbusters when Bill Murray's talking to the mayor, and he's like, Mr. Mayor, let us go do this. And if we miss it, send us to jail. We'll go quietly. But Mr. Mayor, if we're right, you, sir, would have saved the lives of millions of registered voters. To which point the conversation is over and Bill Murray is going to be allowed to go do whatever he wants to go do if the mayor's going to get reelected. So I sort of placed that to him. Like, what is the way that we have to make this argument? Because we're getting beat in the face with it. The problem's identified. Everybody's acknowledged it. Again, the capabilities are there. I think the force structure model could be done right. I mean, all the pieces are on the table, but for some reason, it's still not getting the money and the resources. And I think one of the jokes as the PCA inside the Pentagon dealt mostly with budget stuff. And when you started coming to the table with the kinds of numbers that we were asking for in the Navy to do cybersecurity, it was all rounding error. I was at one point trying to get the Secretary of the Navy to sign off $1.5 billion over the FITUP, $300 million a year, or to say it another way, 0.0007% of a $1.3 trillion budget over the same time frame. And for some reason, the joke is, well, do we have to artificially make this 10 times more expensive? Does it have to do you have to put more zeros behind it for people to start listening to this? And I think that for all the things we would want, I think the smart people can all figure it out because we all agree, like this is kind of an echo chamber. I don't think there's anything said in here that we probably haven't said collectively to each other. So more of a conversation is, what is that thing that we're missing when we present this argument, this plan, this whatever, it's like every single conversation has to be tailor-made to the actual individual you're talking to hit whatever thing they want to understand to push this forward. And I think that's kind of the beginning of this.
And let me pick up on one thought there on that, because and this is a problem with how the question's asked. And it's a good question to ask, but we need to remind ourselves, when we do an executive order or an NSM, there is no money.
Yep.
So everything you said was resources. Things I said implied resources. There's implied resources. They all will. So we actually do, it comes back to what Representative McDermott was saying, which is, we actually have to have an effective cyber leadership in the Hill, because nothing we do in an executive order will fix it if we don't have we'll only bond it, we won't build it. To use your language, you can only build if you get Congress to come along and do these things properly. And so from my perspective, I think it's critical that we replace Mike Gallagher, replace Jim Langevin, the kind of leaders on this. And that hasn't, to a large degree, that hasn't happened, particularly outside armed services. I think there's guys like Garbarino that care about this, but the guy who cared the most for the last 6 months was Mark Green.
Yeah.
And he's leaving in 6 weeks.
Yep.
This is a problem. If we don't fix that, we're going to be in trouble.
I'm not sure if you heard the question I posed to the Congressman. That's exactly what I said. Look, the cyber crisis is sleepy. It's not moving fast. We don't have an industry association that can speak with one voice. So we're not getting the interplay. I actually called out the work you did at Cleary Commission as the example, but we don't have that currently, that really strong exchange of ideas and budget allocations. Where do we need to put budget against it? Mike, I didn't mean to want to interfere. Go ahead.
Oh, good. I actually want to touch on a couple of points. First of all, how much does a submarine cost? $3 billion.
$6 billion.
Block 4 Virginia class, Block 5 Virginia class.
Virginia, not Columbia. Virginia. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's Columbia way more, but the Virginia.
Right. And so you think about what you were asking for over the FIDA, and then you talk about what is a submarine cost and the comparison between them. And we're to the point where we're consistently trying to churn out submarines as fast as possible. Cybersecurity is ultimately going to protect the entire supply chain for those submarines. It's the soft underbelly. So if we're not allocating resources effectively, you might as well be throwing that money out the window as well, because you can't guarantee they're actually going to fire if we don't have solid cybersecurity behind it. So that's the first thing. When it comes to authorities, and I'm going to touch on a little bit of what everybody talked about, because I agree. And I think it's more important. I think the points we're trying to hammer home here and that we're trying to drive are critical. And I just want to put a finer point on each of them. With respect to a cyber force, we talked about the different model, and the Coast Guard model, and everybody kind of looks at that and says, well, yeah, the Coast Guard, the puddle pirates, that's who we want to model our cyber force after. The reason being is it's not about what the Coast Guard is doing. It's about the authorities that they have. The Coast Guard is the only element within the military that has Title 10, which is military authorities, Title 18, which is law enforcement, and Title 50, intelligence activities. Nobody else can do all three simultaneously or switch a hat. And you think of a Coast Guardsman who is on board or embarked on a Navy ship in the Caribbean that is tracking a narcotics vessel. Well, suddenly that Coast Guardsman flips on his law enforcement hat and he goes and boards that vessel. That's no longer a Title 10 military operation. That's a Title 18 law enforcement operation. When our adversaries are looking at the full spectrum of cyber capabilities, they're not saying, well, this is going to be the Chinese MSS conducting an intelligence activity, or this is going to be the Chinese military conducting a military operation. They look across the spectrum and they're going to use proxies, they're going to use ransomware groups, hacktivists, criminals. They're going to create ambiguity so that we don't have effective responses or that we're stuck in our iron silos. The only way to do that is to establish a force that breaks down those silos from an authority's perspective and allows us to be fluid in our defenses and in our offensive operations against the targets that are actually causing us harm. So that's the authorities piece behind the Coast Guard model. In order to get there, from a congressional perspective, and what we're talking about is we don't have solid leadership from a cybersecurity perspective in Congress. We have some within the HASC. We certainly had some in the subcommittee on China that's still there, but it's a subcommittee. And the emphasis that we're really putting on this is it needs to be at a committee level and an appropriations level. And it has to be outside of just defense. It has to also be in Homeland Security. It has to be bipartisan. It has to be bicameral. It has to be by committee. We need to be able to engage with this on multiple levels because the authorities are so critical and the authorities themselves span multiple committees. So critically important there.
Let me, one quick thing there. And I'm glad you highlighted the Coast Guard. I do want to point out Coast Guard's budget for their cyber activities is totally totally ineffective, has been across 4 administrations. That's the only thing they're consistent on there. And like simple things like we direct the Coast Guard port captain to have a cyber expert, and we then don't fund it. So they have to fund it out of Hyde, which means someone's probably doing 2 jobs. Look, the Coast Guard gets good work done. I think their limited number of cyber protect teams or mission force teams are useful because of all those authorities. But until we truly empower these, and you're right, it's budget dust. I mean, if you took all the recommendations, we had like 13 recommendations in this paper on military mobility, put them all together, I'd be surprised if it got over 500 million. And that's over a FIDP to address 4 sectors. The most important sectors for our military mobility and economic productivity. The only place we're spending enough money is Department of Energy. I mean, and the other sectors work, but they work because of like financial services works because we have a strong regulatory regime because most of us want to protect our money. But energy and financial services are about the only 2 that work smoothly. Defense industrial base is 1 notch below that. Again, Daddy Warbucks is funding that, so they're okay. Then it falls off a cliff. These ones, this is not expensive. It just takes, like you said, focus, attention, and attention outside of House Armed Services. I'd go farther. It's not just Homeland. It's ENC, Energy and Commerce, transport, oversight. There's Jim Langevin used to say there's 62 committees and subcommittees between the House, Senate, and appropriators involved in this. And we've got to I don't say we have 62 advocates, but we have to have a lot of strong, driven leaders that can get this done. And I love Gallagher, but the loss of Jim Langevin is probably the biggest loss to the House.
All right, so let's correct another little bit on appropriations because we can write all the policy in the world, whether it be executive orders or whether it be, Mark, you and I are both previous authorizers, but the appropriators are the ones that drive. How do we actually drive the appropriators that want to put money into cybersecurity? I've got some ideas, so I'm not going to be a moderator here, but I want to hear your ideas and then I'll follow up.
So the problem you're going to have is appropriators are hearing risk in every direction, whether that be cyber risk, whether that be economic calamity risk, whether that be disruption from supply chain, and they're having to measure which doomsday is worse. Where they are looking to invest and they get patted on the back for investing is similar to your Ghostbusters comment. What good can we do that sweeps in and buys down some of this risk we hear about every day? And so there's an opportunity to speak to leveraging AI, to supporting new innovations across government, being more technology focused in dragging the maturity of cyber and operational technology with it. But until you get a higher outcome on the positive side, the risk conversation of breaking. And so it's just, there's risk fatigue. They've heard every other day that there's something terrible going to happen tomorrow. And even if it does happen, they're like, well, then we'll reactively take it on. So you have to give them that brass ring to reach for that has as a layer something that matures all our risk mitigations on the way.
I have an answer for that, but I want to hear from you, the rest of you first.
So I learned very, very painfully at my 4 years in the Pentagon. I spent way too much time talking to the authorizers and not enough time talking to the appropriators. I learned that the very, very painful hard way, because you got some things through only to realize that, okay, you didn't actually close the loop with the person who was actually going to move the money from point A to point B. But you get somebody to say, yeah, it's a legitimate spend. And I'm like, oh, victory, I won. And then realizing, oh, no, I didn't close the loop. What we were trying to do is change some of the language. Like when Jen Easterly was at CISA, and the whole idea was secure by design. And I said, well, Jen, I get where you're going with that, but what does secure by design mean? Like, if I have a requirement to keep my kid dry to go to the school bus, I'm going to Target and I'm buying whatever the cheapest raincoat is. If I'm going to, summit Mount Everest, I'm not buying my raincoat at Target. I'm going to spend the money I need to keep me alive. So then the point was, if we move between this conversation of security and resiliency to one of survivability, the survivability implies a different level of effort. For instance, an Arleigh Burke destroyer, CEO of a former Arleigh Burke destroyer, is not built to be resilient. It's built to be survivable. There are dedicated adversary systems that spend nothing but trying to figure out how to put that ship at the bottom of the ocean. And it's not the $3 billion it costs to get it to float. It's the $3 billion that gets it to float when it's on fire with holes in it, trying to defend itself against a dedicated adversary resource trying to put it at the bottom. So then nobody flinches when we say an Arleigh Burke destroyer costs $3 billion. Okay, I guess that's what it costs. But when we buy IT systems, critical infrastructure, all this other stuff, it's, well, how can I get it just out the door? Oh, we need it to be survivable. What's that going to? No, we need to be resilient. No, it needs to be survivable. And there's a cost associated with that. So it's the irony is when the congressman was saying this stuff is really, really expensive. Is it? 500 million sounds like a lot, but when you put it compared to other things, it's nothing. And again, once again, how are we making this argument? Because you probably could invest a couple $2 billion into US infrastructure that would have significant improvements to it, which is not a lot of money compared to other things that we just link. Like, yeah, that's what a $15 billion aircraft carrier, yeah, that's what it costs. That's what we're going to spend on it.
I think that the key is to get, much like we have to get the service chiefs to prioritize cyber so that we can have force generate. The reason they won't prioritize is why we have a cyber force. We have to get cabinet members. I still believe appropriators will take their cues from an administration that is organized. So if the Secretary of Agriculture said cyber is a priority for me and put it in his budget, I believe the appropriators would match it. What the appropriators aren't going to do is go say, you missed this. They do this. They do all the time, cut money out and put it in something else, but that tends to be for something they really like, not opposed to just general good thing. And I've met 3 secretaries of agriculture, and I'm 0 for 3 on having one give a shit about cyber. And it's not that they're bad human beings. They just think on the rack and stack of consequences, they can't envision cyber being the problem. The problem is we had a panel here yesterday that 100% explained why cyber can be the problem. And you got to include FDA in this discussion. But food and ag is absolutely at risk. It's at risk from cyber criminals and cyber nation state actors. You can say the same thing about water with EPA. You can say the same thing. You can go through each critical sector like that. And yet there is just at the very senior level, you're not going to get it. You're just not going to get the cabinet members so far that are willing to say, Department of Education is another one. K-12 education is getting mauled by ransomware. Yet you will not get the Secretary of Education to actually put both education and agriculture, by the way, in the last administration, $250,000, not million, $250,000 was their annual SRM, Sector Risk Management Agency budget. Just to put that in perspective, we all know that's one full-time equivalent. So a human, and I would call that website management. And so until we get senior leaders at the cabinet level to give a shit, we will not solve this problem. And the appropriators are not going to reach in and grab priority number 32 on the secretary's list and fund it like priority number 6.
Do you have anything to say, and I'll follow up?
I do, just very quickly. And I think, again, just to build upon what we were talking about here, typically when appropriators move or we see the needle move, it's after some major event, and especially in a case like this, which we can't afford to have happen. And if you look at all of the various cybersecurity incidents or cyber attacks that have affected this country recently, and I'm talking about in the past 5 years, we can go back and you can say targeting critical infrastructure, whether it's Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Aliquippa, Mole Shoe, the list goes on and on. we still haven't seen that watershed moment that the appropriators are looking at this and saying, that's Pearl Harbor. That's 9/11. And the reason being, I think in large part is because it happens in cyberspace. It's digital. You don't see that physical impact in the same way as we do a 9/11 when we opened up the coffers and we really actually put money behind counterterrorism.
So, and just a funny story, like you're never going to not have a California lawmaker not vote on a fire engine. Like because of what they saw, that lawmakers, everyone like, well, I did not vote for a fire engine. No, what do you need? But that was after the fact. What is the way to get ahead of it?
So first of all, I don't know why Michael and I always, I'm doing a mind meld, but and by the way, this is unscripted. I believe the only way we're going to get an appropriator to move is we got to get the constituents in their district or their state saying, hey, we need this. So I'm focusing on where can we use federal dollars to go after that water system in that appropriator's district, that with a small investment, we can improve the safety of that water. We can reduce risk for that water system. When you have that local city manager calling the appropriator saying, hey, I really want to get this money, we're going to start getting appropriators to move on that. And that's what I want to focus on next year is how do we actually make the cyber threat localized to the district level or to the state level in the appropriations, world. So they start saying, you know what, all I need is $1 million to go towards that water system. I can mitigate risk. They're going to start picking that off across the board. That's what I'm going to focus on in the next year.
I just want to one thing.
You guys could critique me on that.
I want to caution everyone that if your state of success is that the Secretary of the Agriculture Department cares about cyber, we're in trouble. Like we are talking about cabinet members that have discrete mission areas, millions of challenges at their feet. If we are counting on cyber being everyone's priority, you've got a challenge. So I think that you have a problem of how do we get people who don't have cyber as a priority to support those who do have cyber as a priority to be funded and support them in their efforts so that they don't have to take on that workforce funding, the whole package, because what we've seen is that isn't the most successful model.
So, first, I think your priority list is what gets funded. So it has to get somewhere on there. And one thing that worries me is that I've heard the administration recently say, hey, we're going to push it down to the state and local.
All right.
But boy, that better not include like the resourcing, because the federal government, despite everything we say, has money. These state and local resources that actually run utilities like energy and water utilities. This is the old, they don't have two wood nickels to rub together idea. So you can push action down to the state and local, but resourcing is still going to have to come for this. And this is where we have to get smart. And so when we work with appropriators, I think it is, I'm pushing grants programs that say, look, if a venture capital firm's funding this, state authority, this is not an actual case. If a 1% is running owning a local utility, you're probably not going to be able to access this grant program. But if you're like the vast 99.9% of them, and you are a state and local utility being told, hey, running Windows 7 is no longer a successful outcome here, is not going to lead to a successful outcome. As you transition off, you properly do assessments, you meet whatever NIST standards are, you do all these things, you can access a grant program. By the way, this is how the state revolving funds are supposed to work in water and wastewater. They don't, because they end up getting earmarked like anything to other things. But if you do this right, then I think you could have a successful system. The Republicans because it's not a regulatory driven, and Democrats because it's not giving away money to the rich. It meets that sweet spot of meeting a standard that's assessed to properly, and then a grant's given if it's appropriate. Right. I think we could get there, and then you can push it to the state and local for execution. But it starts with the federal government.
All right. So CISA had $100 million per year over 5. That's what they've been put in there, and there was no results shown on that. So how do we improve that program? And that's what I want to talk to Planky about. How do we ultimately start showing results at the district level, appropriator district level, about where the safety? How do we push that to be more effective?
So in that regard, the amount of money that CISA put towards the state and locals with that The state of Maryland, the director of local cybersecurity for Maryland at the time was a very close friend of mine. Maryland got $2.2 million in total to push down across all state and local for cybersecurity as a result of that grant. You can't do anything with 2.2, especially when the vast majority of state and locals, they don't need MDR or they don't need a new EDR solution. They need a managed service provider who's going to come in and actually take control because they don't have the resources, the manpower, the training, the personnel to handle it themselves. And they can't do that with a $2.2 million budget that goes statewide.
We're in agreement. 2.2, you can do nothing. I agree. And that's why I think we need to I'm with Mark, up the grant amount available through states, but more importantly is direct it towards those most vulnerable water authorities.
And I do it by sector. Yeah, water's a good one. And I would have a organization that Kevin Morley was here yesterday from the AWWA. He and I have worked for a long time on a water risk and resilience organization. In other words, you got to have a standard. You don't have to have a regulation, but you have to have a standard. You have to have a way of assessing to that standard, generating a hit list, and then saying, hey, that one legitimately we can pay. Your life cycle maintenance, you're going to have to figure out how to pay that because the government's not into paying, your annual personnel budget.
But initial CapEx.
But the initial CapEx we can help with. But you also have to buy from what, our standard, you can't just randomly go buy like the 50-inch TV screen. These have to be things that are governed properly. I think this is the way to go. I know it's painful, but the way Congress works and the way private sector works, you're going to need to do this sector by sector. Congress has learned its lesson from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act of just, here's a clump of money. Like you said, Maryland got 2.2. I think we'll find another state that got a lot. And then when you ask how did it get distributed, did it get down to that lowest common denominator?
And did it solve a problem or do another study?
And we'll be disappointed.
Right.
So, from my perspective, sector by sector, committee by committee, it's painful, but we're at that point now. The top-down broad executive orders do good. That has not worked. I think it's a bottom-up thing driven sector by sector with real money, though.
Yeah. And the only reason I'm saying water, to me, it's the most existential threat. That's the most vulnerable right now. You're right. There are 16 sectors, but Mark, I wouldn't want to hit all 16 at one time. I would hit water first as a pilot and then see if we can actually get an effective grant program.
Talk to Kevin Morley. He literally has this written.
Well, it's not only
the House
talking to Kevin, but collectively bringing in to talk to Sean, when he gets in and say, okay, let us help you build this program in a way that's.
And I think I saw Josh Corman floating around. He's, in the same, he can help with those. What should that assessment look like? What should that standard achieve look to get? And I think if you mix that kind of talent with the water associations, not just AWA,
rural water,
you're going to be I agree. I unfortunately we have 20 or 21 sectors if you count like the transportation broken up. I would tackle 2 or 3 a year, but you're right. I would not tackle 21 a year. You'll tackle 0 then.
Then we got to show direct results coming. So we got to have those appropriators getting calls from their water authorities in their districts saying that was fantastic. They came in a matter of weeks. We want more of that. So you got to have that groundswell coming into the calls of Congress, because what appropriators care more about, other than federal agencies, they care about their constituents. So you have to have the constituents rising up and saying, yeah, we this is what we need.
So there is a slightly good news story here that was started in the Department of Defense. For those of you, and probably everybody in this room is familiar with the Mosaics effort. Now, what was interesting about Mosaics, it was a JCT, a Joint Capability Technology Demonstration, done at the joint level. The Navy was sort of the spearheader of this. They applied it at a power station down in, I think it was North Island in California to demonstrate this. What that later went on to do is go over to the Applied Physics Laboratory. They took this construct. They created, for all practical purposes, zero trust model. So many pillars, so many things they have to identify. They took a bunch of products, they ran them through analysis of alternatives and said, Mosaics does, Tenable does this, Armis does this, Dragos does this. So to Mark's point, some of that work has been done and is sitting kind of now at the Applied Physics Laboratory, sponsored by the DoD. But again, having conversations with Jen Easterly, it's like the DoD has done something that is sort of universally applicable across, critical infrastructure.
So my suggestion there, and again, we use Charleston Water as an example. That in Jacksonville is take Mosaics, put it towards the civilian waterworks, do a review. So we are trying to use DoD dollars, because it's DCI, Defense Critical Infrastructure, on going into that local water authority, working with them too.
One of the places that there seems to be a lot of light and heat on right now is Guam. Right, we saw Guam get hit by a Volt typhoon. Interestingly enough, actual typhoons. That's right, actual typhoons. Interestingly enough, as the PCA went out to visit Guam right around that time frame, and Guam's kind of a petri dish where you could sort of pull this all together. The Navy still owns all the water on the island. Ever since the invasion of the island, the Navy has delivered potable water to the island for 60, 70 years now. Power is still provided by the Guam Power Authority, but you have all the interested parties in a relatively small geographical area that you could sort of represent this. And if you could figure it out on this island, that could be the proof that you need to then begin to.
So I don't know if you know
that it's a liberation of the island as well.
Yeah, exactly right. Liberty. So I don't know if you know, we were supposed to have Chuck Weisenbaum on this panel as well, specifically to talk Immortal Phoenix. He could no longer because of security issues. So he's now detailed to the Secretary of Defense Office. But you're absolutely right. I wanted to actually talk Guam on this stage for the benefit of our audience. And our Guam expert basically had to self-remove himself.
So one of the things that in this conversation we have to make sure we do is separate business systems from mission and operational systems. Right now, when you go on the Hill and you say cyber, the relationship to, even in the executive branch, is the laptop in front of them, their email, their cell phone. This is not where our all hands on deck needs to be. Business systems have processes to be hardened. They don't need the thought factory in this room or rooms across the Capitol focused on how to make sure my M365 doesn't get popped. Yeah, it gets popped every day, but that's not where we need thought leadership. It's not where we need appropriator language. It's where we need people to understand that those standards exist. And to Mike's point, you could have a managed service provider handle that. States, municipalities, organizations across the planet should have their business systems tailored in a way or have someone tailor it for them. Mission-based operational technology, field-based gear, tech, and data is where this next 5 years has to focus. As we've already done the hard work past, and the Hill hasn't got it yet. They don't understand that they're two things. In a CISO CIO world, they don't want to necessarily acknowledge they're two things either because they want to hide some of that upgrading of their current IT and some of the spending we give them for OT.
Okay, I'm watching time right now. We're coming up on the original time. I know we got a lot more we're going to talk about. Is there any audience questions that are just burning and compelling right now? Oh, crap. Okay. Because I do want to get to final words and then if you could take this, I want to get to a final lightning round too before we turn over to the next panel.
So I want to build on that last point that you guys just made about business versus OT. So I work for a local water utility in Loudoun County. We have done a lot of outreach with CISA to have folks actually come visit, get out of their bubble, come to our facility, learn what a water plant is, learn what a wastewater plant is. How do we get appropriators, decision makers, Congress folks, staff to do the same thing?
Not to your water district?
Any
Guam, I tell you, that's where you bring Guam back. That's where the Codell, honestly, if you want a Codell, I would not list Loudoun County on the most likely to go to.
And I don't want to.
You're not asking for that, But no, that's it. I mean, the way you do it is you tie it to, like I said at the beginning, you tie it to national security. You get them interested. But Guam's a great one. One right near a military facility, like a major military facility, so near Fort Cavazos, Fort Hood, or Mayport.
We're looking at Charleston and
Jacksonville. That's another good one.
Desirable places.
In other words, where you can see a couple and you can then go see some other thing, and that gets it together. And then you can mix the congressional delegations in there. And appropriators often are on 3 or 4 subcommittees, the way they work. It's a much tighter system. So that's how I do it. I think that's a great idea. I honestly think if it weren't such a distance, Guam would be the great one because you can see it. The only problem in Guam is with the government owning the water system. That is, I actually think they need to see where the water system is not owned by the government or by one of the private sector.
I agree.
But is actually owned by a state utility. By the way, Charleston's great because you can see the port. I mean, you can see a rail juncture. You can really catch a lot with Charleston.
You're seeing the genius there and why we picked Charleston. There was another question coming in.
Yeah, over here. So where I am in my career right now, I'm really focused on strategic items, less tactical, more strategic, 3-5-year horizon type items that take time to solve. How do we make changes at the government level that allow programs that are strategic in nature survive the political cycles, survive the tick-tock of bicameral system, as you were saying earlier? How do we make that kind of stickiness to what we're trying to accomplish here?
Grow up in an autocracy. It works. They're very good at 5-year planning. Assuming you want to hang out in a democracy, honestly, the Department of Defense does do 5-year planning. I mean, the word FIDP exists for a reason. It's legitimate. When any other agency shows me their FIDP, I laugh. I said, there's no, the F in FIDP for them is first, because that's literally the only thing it's worthwhile for. So I think it's very hard to get this. But I think if we've made the compelling bottom-up argument and the constituents are arguing for it, I think we'll eventually get 3- and 5-year plans. But that doesn't exist right now. So I think the answer to the question is outside of defense, not easily.
Can I jump on that? Because this is what I want to end with. But I also want to give a final round here. That's exactly what we're asking for. Someone brought up earlier, we're in an echo chamber. We're all talking to people, and we're not necessarily, nothing leaves outside this room unless we write it down. So that is what I'm making the call for. And I'm going to miss Shark Tank this afternoon, Bryce, and I'm sorry about that. But my idea is take some of the thought leaders in this room and this conference, just write either a paragraph or a page. What would you like to see in an initiative? Then have the experts on this panel who also know how to either turn it into an executive order, turn it into legislation. Start making those movements forward. I mean, there's a huge difference what can be done by executive order. That's not sticky, but legislation is. Solarium Commission did an amazing job of putting in legislative fixes. We need to continue that, whether it's through critical effect, whether it's through other conferences, but we need to gather together and start exchanging papers and then figure out those of us who understand the difference between legislation and executive orders can make the determination ultimately, how do we get this? That's why I asked a question earlier. We got to revive the cyber caucus. It's sleepy right now. No one's taking input. Mark's actually correct. There are no new thought leaders. We need to send it to whoever we can, saying, okay, this needs to be the next generation of legislation, and whatever can fit into an executive order, do that as well. Final thoughts coming down the end, whoever wants to start.
So just from a strategic point of view, just know that appropriators are talking 2027, 2028 right now. So if you want to talk strategic, they're doing line items for how money in the federal government is going to be spent in those years. Now, does it change and get all kind of wonky every year? Yes. But if you want to get ahead of the next year and the next year, they're doing the tail of that snake right now. As far as just closing statements, I would say that we have a challenge with both, as was said when the congressman was here, both offensive, defense, and resiliency. But we aren't tackling it in a smart enough way where we're isolating specific use cases where we can demonstrate success. And so until we demonstrate success, where we can actually show someone that the risk was mitigated enough where others are going to say, you did a good job. Right now, it's all thin ice. It doesn't matter what CEO you talk to, what CISO you talk to. There is no thick ice to stand on. Everything could break at any moment, and everyone is jittery, like they had too much coffee. So we have to find a use case that allows us to show what good looks like, even at a granular level, or we're going to struggle to find success in the long term.
So 2 thoughts. The first is that I'm excited to see Sean Cairncross come in and be the National Cyber Director. When we conceived this at the Cybersecurity Commission, I would say at this point, if he is not successful, the NCD was not a good idea because we have now completely different conditions than we had 4 years ago. We have an NSC fixated elsewhere, not on defensive cyber. We have a CISA that I think is temporarily weakened by some of the actions that have happened. But the reality is, and I think Sean Plank is going to dig in hard there to get the troop to task right in CISA. That gives the NCD a great opportunity to a lot of running room. And I'm excited. And I think Sean Cairncross has some of the very unique skill sets that are necessary in terms of interagency and relationship building and having relationships inside the White House. The second one, I'll make it quick, is we didn't mention the National Guard here today. I think the National Guard is going to play a big role. And I would much rather have a good National Guard than a letter of marque. I recognize that one won't be ready before the other is, so it might be that you do both. But the reality is we need to have a robust National Guard. If we had a cyber force, by the way, I could really see how that cyber guard with a cyber reserve force, cyber auxiliary could
Yeah.
really be fantastic.
Guard and 32 status could do a lot for a governor at the state level. Yeah.
I think I want to pick up on we were talking about Loudoun County water. We have to identify and understand that in the critical infrastructure world, a lot of these things are legitimate military targets to our adversaries. So God forbid if we get a war with Iran tomorrow and they start attacking water and power, well, if they're supporting military missions, they're legitimate targets. They're under the laws of armed conflict. They're legit things that they could do to us based on this if we go into a state of war with them. There was an interesting report. It was never released by the NSTAC. This is like 10 or 15 years ago. And what the report was basically trying to say is if you took script kiddies all the way up to nation states, what organizations should be able to survive what? You know, I expect flower shops to be on the low end of that. I would expect critical infrastructure to be on the high end of that. But at some point, there comes a point where you fail. Like, and the analogy, the metaphor I'd use is in this room, if a small fire breaks out, we're all ambulatory humanoids that could probably have the ability to pick up a small fire extinguisher and put it out. We'd all be expected to do that. We're expected not to play with matches. We're expected not to leave oily rags in a pile. But if this building's on fire, that's what the fire department's for. The state, you pay taxes. There's organizations that are man-trained and equipped to do things that you're not. So when we ask about people to be able to withstand certain things, I might go to Loudoun County and say, I expect you as a water organization to do X. But if you are actually in the crosshairs because your water supplies, I may not be able to expect you to do Y. How am I prepared to come in and help you get through that when you are a legitimate military target of our adversaries? So that's the next thing in legislation. I just can't say do secure by design and just push this all on you and said, you should be able to go buy a product or train your workforce or whatever. Well, if I won the lottery, I don't think the mayor of my town would say, well, Chris, you're rich now, put a fire engine in your front yard. And if there's a fire at your house, I expect you to deal with it. That's not how any of this is set up. And I think we need capability and capacity that help organizations do the things they're expected to do. And then here's the things I'm not expecting you to do. And I will show up to help you get through those things.
But CMMC.
Oh, I forgot about that.
I know it's the devil. Nobody wants to talk to you.
The last thing, and I know we are at time, and so I'm going to be very brief. When it comes to the distinction between IT and OT, this is something that is critical and that the vast majority of legislators and appropriators completely understand. When we talk about the difference between IT and OT, put it in context of the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. Legislators focus on data breaches. They focus on cybersecurity in the context of confidentiality. If you look at all of the frameworks that we have that deal with critical infrastructure to date, they're all focused on how do you protect data? How do you protect the confidentiality of it? And you look at HIPAA, you look at the NIST 800-171, trying to protect controlled unclassified information. It's all about the data. I would posit that we need to focus much more keenly on the availability and the integrity of that data, particularly when it comes to operational technology. And to date, we don't have any regulation that focuses on the availability and the integrity as it relates to operational technology.
I will follow up on that. When we talk OT as a cyber community, we are talking cyber safety. Stop talking cybersecurity for OT. At that point, it's human safety. You have to make the distinction between IT and OT. One is a confidentiality threat, a data threat. The other one can kill you or cause property damage. You've got to make it clear to legislators that there's a difference there. Human safety is mandatory. We have to protect it. I'll finish off. Anybody in this room that would like to or online who would like to write and get some stuff on, we do have connectivity to like Sean and others. Katie and New AC Cyber, get it in because we are going to be writing for them. We are going to be advising them, serving them, giving them good ideas. So if you want to join that, let me know. Give me a business card afterwards, and I'll be sure I'll be taking all your hard work and all your input. That's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.